says fraud is deceit or trickery, an intentional perversion of truth in order to induce another to part with something of value or to surrender a legal right, an act of deceiving or misrepresenting, a trick, one who is not what he pretends to be. In other words, the bill that says a Federal Reserve note, it's not what it intends to be, cheat. One is not what it seems or is represented to be. Go to the next slide, please. So Federal Reserve notes are not notes. So what are they? They're pieces of paper with ink on them. They're paper tickets or tokens. And now I ask the question, well, what does it matter? Come back to me, please. So people have this notion of money. You know, you work all week, you get paid at the end of the week, you take the money to the grocery, whatever, you buy what you need. What's the difference whether it's a real note or not a note? I mean, who cares? And the answer is there's a second function of money. We don't use money just to buy the stuff that we need this week. We also use money to provide for future payment, for our pensions, for annuities, for savings, for a rainy day, for college education for our kids. There's a very well-known story in China before they had their runaway inflation in 1946 to 1949, which brought the communists to power, by the way, more than anything else. So Chinese people are very education conscious. And so in a lot of times, Chinese families would set aside money every week in order to accumulate enough savings so that when their children go to school, they would have the money. And so there's a story about this one family. They saved and saved from the time the kid was born, and by the time the kid came time to go to college, the purchasing power of the money had depreciated so much, they took all of it and bought him a birthday cake. So in other words, the savings of a lifetime that were accumulated for a particular purpose, when the time came to use it for that purpose, it was worthless. So in fact, these Federal Reserve notes, they're not notes, these so-called Federal Reserve notes that we have as money today, they're really just tokens. And so the question comes up, well, a lot of times tokens are better than money. Better than money. Now let's go to the next slide, please. So one example of a token that's better than money is the Metro card. And we use these Metro cards to buy fares for the subway, for the buses and whatnot. And the reason it's better than money is because you don't have to fumble around to find it to make the payment. You can put, I don't know, $40, $50, $60, $80 on a Metro card. It's convenient, fits in your wallet. But who in their right mind would take Metro cards for their pension? So in other words, the fact that these Federal Reserve notes, come back to me please, the fact that these Federal Reserve notes can be easily used for day-to-day purchases is besides the point. Who cares about that? What's important to people in terms of money is to be able to provide for future payment, for when you cannot work. The labor people have a song for this. It's called Too Old to Work, Too Young to Die, How Am I Going to Get By? And the answer is you save. But if it turns out that when it comes time to utilize your savings that it doesn't buy anything, well, what's the point of savings? And in America, since the money has been depreciating greatly over the last 30, 40 years, the savings rate has gone down close to zero. And so people are not saving. Why save a depreciating asset? In effect, most people, ordinary people, are depending in large part on their Social Security, on pensions that have been promised to them by employers. And in fact, what's happening very rapidly now is that the purchasing power of the Social Security money is evaporating. Oh, I know, you think that the Social Security is somehow key to the Consumer Price Index. Well, those of you who have been watching this show before, you know that the Consumer Price Index has been manipulated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and that the methodology for computing it has been changed 4 times since the Clinton years. So as a result of violating Jewish law, by misrepresenting to people on the nature of their money, in effect, we're cheating people out of their pensions, out of their Social Security, out of benefits for disabled veterans, and anything that's been promised, such as annuities. Now here's another example of the fraud on our money. Let's come to the next slide, please. This is an image of a $1 silver certificate. Now you can't read the little writing at the bottom. I'm going to blow that up in a second. But what it says, we'll pay to the bearer on demand $1. So right under Washington, there's writing. Now let's go to the next slide, please. And here's what it says. We'll pay to the bearer on demand $1. So this is a promise to pay. Go back to the last slide, please. So this image, this isn't the dollar. This is a promise to pay $1. And of course, in time, this promise was broken. Skip ahead now, another slide, And this is what the bill looks like now. And now it no longer says a promise to pay $1. Come back to me, please. So now the broken promise, come back to me, please. So now the broken promise to pay $1 has become $1. That's stupid. I mean, how stupid can stupid be? And how come people don't notice this? And the answer is we've been misrepresented to. We've been tricked. And this is the indicia of a fraud. And again, this violates the Genevas Das commandment in Jewish law not to misrepresent, not to fool the people. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, I've spoken now in the last session about misrepresenting the strongly held views of the founders on the paper money, and I've just spoken a little bit about misrepresentations on the paper money itself, and now I want to talk about misrepresenting the provisions of the Constitution. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here's the question I want to address now. What powers does the Constitution grant the government, and what does it not grant the government with regard to money? Come back to me, please. Now, when the founders met at the Constitutional Convention, they were not supposed to write a constitution. They were supposed to amend the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation allowed the government to what they call emit bills of credit. In other words, in those days, it meant to print money. The founders had had a very bad experience with the paper money, and if you watch the first part of this show, you know what that experience was. People like Jefferson got cheated out of the inheritance that his wife inherited. In fact, he was in debt his entire life. At the end, he was bankrupt, and they had to auction off his belongings at Monticello in order to help pay his debts, which were not sufficient to pay his debts. People like James Madison, another founder, had leased his land prior to the Revolution, and the people to whom he leased it paid it off in paper money, which was depreciated. George Washington remarked that it would take a wagon load of money to buy a wagon load of provisions. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, called the paper money a cheat. Alexander Hamilton warned against paper money. And so when they got to the Constitutional Convention, and they voted on this, they voted down the notion of issuing paper money. And here's what they wrote in Article 1, Section 8. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, this is right out of the Constitution. So here they give the federal government the power to coin money, to regulate the value thereof, and I want to talk about that in a moment, and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. That is the only power given to the general government in connection with money. Come back to me, please. So you see, they gave them the power to coin money. Now, what does that mean, to regulate the value thereof? Well, regulate in those days, if you look in the dictionaries of the time, and Dr. Edwin Vieira, who wrote the magnificent Pieces of Eight, the Monetary Powers and Disabilities of the Constitution, what regulate meant was to fix. And the value is not the purchasing power. The value is the precious metal content in the coins. In other words, what that amendment, what that provision in the Constitution means, Article 1, Section 8, to fix the value, is to say how much silver a coin had, how much gold a coin had. This is not to say that they could change the value of $1. The word dollar is mentioned twice in the Constitution, once in connection with the slave tax, which went away, but also, very importantly, in connection with the Seventh Amendment, which guarantees a trial by jury for any dispute $20 or more. Now, if it were true that the Congress could make the dollar anything the Congress wanted it to make it, add metal, subtract metal, make it a piece of paper or whatnot, that would mean that the Congress could rewrite the Seventh Amendment at will. That is absurd. And so the dollar had to mean a particular thing. And what it meant was the Spanish mill dollar. And again, if you've been watching this program, you know that whole story. And when Hamilton wrote the Coinage Act of 1792, here he defined the dollar as 371.25 grains of silver. Where did he get that crazy